You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Today, we are going to be taking a look at the second half of Murray Rothbard's legendary essay, The Anatomy of the State, and talk about his understanding of the way in which state and state power functions in society. And so again, if you haven't listened to the first episode or part one of this, I would highly recommend going back and checking out that episode. And this is going to be a really important episode as well, because we're going to use what we discussed in part one and part two of Anatomy of the State to then kind of think about the ways in which the writers of the Bible critiqued state power. And I think that we're going to find that there's a lot of overlap. And so over the course of the next couple of weeks, of course, I have no idea if I'm going to schedule interviews or whatever, so it might be a few weeks before we get to them, but we're going to take a look at 1 Samuel 8, and we're going to take a look at Romans 13 and kind of see how the way in which the state is understood by those authors is reflected in kind of Murray Rothbard's understanding of the state. Again, the goal is not to take the anatomy of the state and impose it upon the Bible as if to say that the Bible affirms everything that Murray Rothbard says. That's not the case. I just think that there's a lot of overlap between the ways in which Rothbard critiques the power of the state and the ways in which the writers of the Bible critique the power of the state. So again, if you haven't listened to part one, I would highly recommend going back and checking that out. But if you want a quick review, if you listened to it last week or a couple weeks ago and you haven't, and you don't remember everything that I said, again, I left a link, I think, in the show notes for that episode. I'm going to leave a link in the show notes for this episode too, to where you can go and find the Anatomy of the State over on Mises.org. You can download the entire PDF for free, and I think they even have an audiobook version of it as well, so if you wanted to listen to it instead of reading it, you could. But just to give you a brief review of the first half of Murray Rothbard's 1974 essay, he is going to define the state, Rothbard does here in this essay, as being the institution that has a monopoly on violence in a particular geographic area and generates revenue through coercion, and that these two categories are characteristic of all states. And so again, you can kind of break down the way in which states or governments use their power in those two ways: that a government or a state has a monopoly on violence in a given area. In other words, they have the final say in whether or not somebody is allowed to use violence. They're the ones that are supposed to be able to arbitrate who can and can't use violence in society, and also that they generate all of their revenue through coercion and not through production. So it's characteristics of states that they don't actually make anything. What they do is they tax people that make things, and they're able to build up the state based on what they take from productive people. And so again, this is true even when there are government-run organizations, like when your town puts on like a fair or whatever, and vendors have to pay in order to get into the fair. That's always the argument that governments always make, is that they generate revenue, that they bring in money for the town or for the city, but the state wouldn't be able to put those on in the first place. The government wouldn't be able to have those events and those kind of organizations in the first place if they hadn't at first taken money from other people or taxed other people, taken some of the fruits of their productive activity. And so again, this is what Murray Rothbard is going to say. And if you're new to libertarian thinking, or if you've never thought deeply about the nature of the state, I really want you to step back and just think about how true that is, that states have a monopoly on violence. They have the quote unquote right to use violence when the rest of us do not. And they're inherently not productive. States aren't productive because they rely on generating revenue through coercion, through using that monopoly on violence, money or whatever a state is receiving in terms of taxes from other people, and they do that by the use of force. He's then going to argue that one of the primary functions of the state is to preserve and legitimize itself, and there are several ways that states do this. And so the examples that he gives is that states are always going to appeal to tradition. Well, we've had these laws forever, and we've had these institutions forever, therefore we should maintain these institutions. States are also going to appeal to science. And again, Murray Rothbard writes this in the 1970s, and even then in. And I think, again, anyone writing in the second half of the 20th century was probably very painfully aware of ways in which massive states had used science as a justification for overreach. Again, the kind of the entire Nazi ideology that Jews were ethnically inferior to Germans and to people of other races was based on their understanding of the science. The state used the language of science to legitimate its power. And then more recently, we've also seen over the last couple of years how these just really careless appeals to science, as if science is some sort of objective, transcendent entity, almost as if science is a god. The state appealed to the language of and the narrative of science to legitimate itself in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then again, the idea, another way that the state legitimates itself is through the idea that it provides the public with protection, that the public could not protect itself in the absence of a state. And all of this is done through the utilization of state-sponsored intellectuals, or intellectuals that align themselves with the values of the state. So Murray Rothbard is going to argue then that the state creates conditions that make it difficult for people to question its assumptions, and that the state creates the perception in nominally democratic societies. And we say nominally democratic because Murray Rothbard has a lot of problems with the concept of democracy and whether or not democracy is actually workable in large societies. But again, the state creates this perception in nominally democratic societies that the state is supposed to represent all of us collectively, even though the state can never represent everyone's interests. Because again, if you have a democracy, if you have a state that's backed by democracy and one person disagrees, then the state does not represent the interest of that person that disagrees. Therefore, the state can never represent us collectively. So that's kind of what he deals with in the first half of the essay, The Anatomy of the State. And we looked at the first couple of sections there in the first part of our analysis of Murray Rothbard's article. So we're going to turn now to section 4, which is called How the State Transcends Its Limits. In section 4, Murray Rothbard is going to talk about how the state is able to break out of the restraints that the citizens often place on it. And so if you learned about civics at all in school, and unfortunately a lot of people that go to government schools don't really learn about civics. They don't really learn about how the government works. And if they do, they get a very idealized and a very kind of mythologized way of understanding about how governments work. But if you learn civics at all in school, you are often told that the U.S. government was built with checks and balances to ensure that one branch cannot accumulate too much power. And again, this idea goes back to the great Enlightenment thinker Montesquieu, and a lot of the thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu of the Enlightenment were living in, kind of a European society at that time that had been destroyed by these absolute monarchs, and there were all kinds of conflicts regarding the power of the church and the state. And so these political theorists of the Enlightenment period were trying to find ways to restrain government, to make sure that government interfered as little as possible in the lives of its citizens. And Montesquieu came up with this idea of the separation of powers, that the only way to do that is to make sure that if you have a government or if you have a state, that not that one person or one group within that state cannot have all the power. And so he said that you divide the state up into these different branches, and they're all given different powers, and those powers keep other branches in check. And so again, that was Montesquieu's idea. One of the things that I would imagine that even if you did learn about Montesquieu in our 7th grade social studies curriculum, we have a couple of days where we talk about Enlightenment political philosophy, and we deal with Montesquieu in a very small manner, but we do talk about him. But I'm going to assume that you probably didn't learn about the 9th or the 10th Amendments, and that the 9th and 10th Amendment devolves most power to individuals and to the state. So even within our own Constitution, these checks were created at the federal level based on Montesquieu's ideas of the separation of power. But the 9th and 10th Amendments, which are kind of like the grand finale of the Bill of Rights, devolves everything that's not specifically enumerated to the federal government back to the states and back to the individuals. And this is the idea that, again, political decisions are best made on the local level. So built into our own Constitution is this idea of decentralization and this idea of limited government. And again, I think it's because the federal government has become steadily more powerful powerful and centralized since the end of the Civil War, really going back to the middle of the 19th century, that we've seen the state in the United States transcend its limits. We've seen the government only grow in scope and size and in power, and with that has come a lot of abuses of state power, as everyone who's listening to this that's already a libertarian will be well aware. And so one of the things that Murray Rothbard is going to explore in this section is how is it that a state that is limited by a constitution like the United States can transcend or overcome the limits that the Constitution places on it. And so he's going to make the argument that checks and balances, going back to Montesquieu, were designed to limit the power of the state, that the Enlightenment philosophers of government, they got it right, that if you're going to have a government, then there should be checks and balances, and it should be constitutionally based with the explicit purpose of limiting the ability for anyone in government to exercise an unlimited amount of power. And that's a really important dynamic in the way that Murray Rothbard is going to explain this. So what he's going to argue is that the intellectual allies of the state turn these concepts into legitimations for the state. And so Rothbard's going to give a couple of powerful examples of this. What he means by that is, again, we discussed this a little bit in the last episode, that there will always be academics and scholars and people in the media that unquestioningly support the state because they benefit from the power that access to the state gives them. So it's very obvious that if you're a politician and you have a lot of power in society, you're going to be an apologist for the state. And this is one of the problems with the modern conservative movement, that a lot of libertarians and even like really good like paleo conservatives that are aware of like the actual philosophical goals of conservatism, which are limited government, lower taxes, and things like that. Everyone is aware that a lot of modern GOP politicians don't really want to limit the power of the state. They just want to use the power of the state in ways that are different than their progressive counterparts. And so that's a really good example of how the state has intellectual allies, that you have mouthpieces that are politicians. But again, you also think too, some of the people that are the most vocal in the need for the state to gain more and more power are those that work in state-funded universities. And a lot of the kind of mainstream ideas about redistributive economic policies and about, social justice theories come from academics that work at state-sponsored institutions, and that to a certain degree are going to earn money and make a paycheck regardless of whether or not there's a market for it, because to a large degree, the state doesn't have a total monopoly on higher education, but the state definitely has an unfair advantage in that market. And so obviously there are going to be intellectuals and people that work at that level that are going to abet the state. This also is a phenomenon that takes place in the media as well. And I think there are a lot of journalists that are I'm not going to use the term brainwashed, but they're influenced by their time in college to have particular sets of beliefs about political philosophy and things like that. And then they go and work in media outlets that are designed to reinforce those beliefs. And unfortunately, as we know, a lot of institutions of higher education are inherently progressive. Again, they're receiving money from the states, and the government backs up all of the student loans that are given out to students that attend those state-funded institutions. And so there are very few economic incentives for people that work in those kinds of institutions to want to limit the power of the state because they benefit on it. And then if you go into media and you were kind of raised in this, and your intellect or your way of thinking about politics was formed in this political echo chamber at these higher education institutions, and then you wind up going out and getting a job in the media, and you're also in another media echo chamber where the people that work at your news network all believe in the exact same set of principles as you do, it's going to be very difficult for you to criticize the state. So that's kind of what Murray Rothbard is getting at when he talks about how the state has all of these intellectual allies, and they're going to use concepts like checks and balances and like limiting the power of the state in order to actually increase the size and the scope of the state. So it's insidious in the way that it's like, they're going to use the language of limiting government to actually dramatically increase the size and scope of government. And one of the best and most interesting examples that he gives here is the example of natural rights. And for me, I've taught talk to a lot of anarcho-capitalists or people that are kind of anarchism adjacent, and I'm not quite there yet. Like I said, I still do believe in the idea of natural rights, and I believe that with the great Enlightenment philosopher John Locke, that the government is only there. The only reason why the government exists is to protect our natural rights, and those rights are our rights to life, liberty, and property. And so the original idea of natural rights in the Lockean sense is that all people are born with natural rights that can neither be given by the government or abridged or taken away by the government. So the government doesn't grant rights, and the government does not take away rights from the people. The only purpose of government is to protect our natural rights. And again, John Locke and a lot of the other Enlightenment thinkers, including I think most of the framers of the Constitution, basically had that conception of rights, that people were designed to be free, that you have your life, you have your liberty, you have your property, and insofar as those things do not interfere with somebody else's ability to have their own life and their own liberty and their own property, then you have the right to make whatever choices you want. And the government only exists to kind of arbitrate when there's a dispute, when somebody's life, liberty, or property are under threat. So again, Locke would say that the only purpose of government is to protect our natural rights. And one of the points that Murray Rothbard makes, and again, he's writing, in the wake of the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, he argues that the state and the intellectuals that abet the state have slowly expanded this concept of natural rights to include what are known as group-specific rights. And some of the examples of those, he doesn't give these in particular in the book. He gives some other examples of it. But an example of a group-specific right would be something like gay rights or women's rights, as well as the rights of benefits of production. So things like health care, the right to a job, the right to college. So what he says is that the state and the intellectuals that support them, they take that language of natural rights and they then apply it to very tiny group-specific rights. And one of the problems that Murray Rothbard is going to see with this, and this is a really interesting argument that's hard for people to understand, because the moment that you challenge the concept of something like, for instance, gay rights in American society today, everyone thinks that you're automatically a bigot or a homophobe or a sexist or whatever, because people don't want to hear any nuance in that argument. The actual argument that Rothbard is going to make is that natural rights should be equally applied to all people. So it doesn't matter if you're gay, it doesn't matter if you're black, it doesn't matter if you're a woman. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and property. Everyone should be able to share in those natural rights, and the government should protect those natural rights for all people. But the problem with group-specific or civil rights that Rothbard is going to illuminate here is that when rights are given to a particular group, they are always given to a particular group at the expense of somebody else's rights. And we have an excellent example of this that's taken place over the last 10 years or so. When you think about, I think it was the name of the company was maybe the Masterpiece Cake shop. It was in Colorado, and it was a baking company or a cake company that refused to bake a cake for a gay wedding because the owner was a Christian who had a conscientious objection to same-sex marriage. And what happened in that cake is that instead of respecting the private rights of the baker, he was sued for not baking the cake in the name of gay rights. And Murray Rothbard would say that would be clearly an abridgment of that person's natural rights. And I think that he's absolutely correct there, because again, if you go back to the idea that all human beings have natural rights and that the government only exists to protect those natural rights, then you can, if you are a business owner, deny service to anybody that you want. Like, you have the right to tell anyone that you want no for any reason. It doesn't matter what your internal disposition is. It doesn't matter what your moral motive is. If you own a business, you have the right to turn down somebody that you do not want to sell your business to. Of course, Rothbard would make the argument, outside of this, and almost all, kind of Austrian or Chicago school economist would make the argument that doesn't make any sort of inherent sense for a business to turn away a customer. If there is a customer who is willing to pay for a service or a good that a business is willing to provide, most businesses are always going to take that. And if you have a truly competitive economy where there are no barriers to entry to the market, if there's one firm that refuses to provide a service or a good to a particular group of people, then another firm will emerge that will provide that service to that group of people. And so it creates kind of this inherent, and this is one of the beautiful things really from an Austrian perspective or from a free market perspective about capitalism, is that it is the profit motive that overcomes the subjective preferences of business owners, right? So it doesn't matter how like racist or how homophobic, if we can even use those terms in modern America anymore, really, but it doesn't matter how you feel about other people. What matters is the profit motive. And so you might in your heart of hearts have a subjective preference for one group of people over another group of people, but in a market economy where you want to make money, you're going to take money from anyone who's going to be willing to give it to you if you're a smart business owner. And if you don't, then your business is either going to be hurt and somebody else will come in and take over the market, or you're going to go out of business. You're not going to be able to provide yourself and pay your bills. And so this is a really good example of where a lot of these sort of civil rights, not only are they clear violations of other people's rights to private property and liberty, because again, if you're a Christian and you own a business and for whatever reason, and I don't think this is biblical or ethical or anything like that, but if you don't want to provide a service or a good for one group of people, you shouldn't be forced by the government to do that. You have the right to say no to potential customers. And again, one of the problems with group specific rights here too is that it also denies the right of selection from people that are of perceived minority groups. So if you are black or if you're gay and you have a business and you want your business to cater to a specific part of the population. So let's say if you have let's say that you're black and you only want to provide a particular service for customers that are black, you should have every right to do that. And again, you're going to have to bear the responsibility for whether or not you can find a market that's willing to pay for your services, knowing that you restrict your services or your goods to a certain group of people. So not only are these kind of rights unnecessary, but they're also an abridgment or an infringement upon somebody else's right. And then he'll go on to talk about benefits of production rights, which are, for instance, things like welfare, or when people say that we need to have free health care or free college tuition. The point that he makes is that all of these things, all of these benefits of production rights are paid for using the money that the government has coercively confiscated from productive people. So again, it denies those who are productive the right to make decisions about their own money by transferring through state power wealth that they earn to those that did not earn the wealth, which again, from a classical natural rights perspective, is an obvious assault on rights. If you work a job and you make money, you should be able to keep your money. The state does not have a right to come in and take your property, which your money should be your property. The state does not have a right to come in and spend it on things that the state deems is necessary. But if you turn on the news, it doesn't matter whether or not you're listening to progressive news or whether or not you're listening to conservative news. There are people on all sides of the issues that think that the government should be able, and the government has a right to take money from people and give it to other groups of people, and they will use the language of rights to justify their position, whether it's Again, a great example of this would be the Patriot Act after 9/11. The idea was that the government had the responsibility to dramatically increase its size and scope and to spend more and more of our money on the military in the name of protecting our rights or keeping us safe. And you can also see how this works for the welfare state, taxing companies, taxing individuals, taxing all of these different groups in society in order to pay for people that are not productive or that are underproductive. It's a really big problem. And again, from a natural rights perspective, it's an obvious assault on our rights that is justified by people in the media, by intellectuals, by academics, and by other groups like that. The other problem that he's going to deal with here is judicial review in the Supreme Court. So according to Murray Rothbard, the Supreme Court is kind of the best example of the way in which having an independent judiciary or having a system in which you have a judge or a court decide whether or not an action of the government supersedes the constitutional restraints that is put on it. The Supreme Court is, in theory, as Murray Rothbard is going to point out here, independent. So the idea in the Constitution is that you have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, and the judicial branch is supposedly independent, and it's supposedly designed to place a check on the power of the legislature and the executive branch. So the Supreme Court can decide whether or not an action that's taken by either of those two entities is constitutional. But if you look, Murray Rothbard makes point, if you look at the way in which the Supreme Court has often been used, it almost always legitimizes state power. There are very, very few examples over the last 100 to 150 years of the Supreme Court ruling in such a manner that it limited the power of the federal government and gave power over to states and individuals. It almost never happens, which is one of the reasons why I think that the Dobbs decision was so difficult for people to understand, because it was a clear breach from the precedent that our Supreme Court has set of kind of almost always giving a rubber stamp to federal power. It was a rare example when power was kicked back to the states, and there's not a lot of that happens at that level. And so the problem, again, as Murray Rothbard is going to say, as we kind of alluded to a second ago, is that if a court deems a law to be constitutional, then it is going to be interpreted by society as constitutional, even if it is fundamentally antithetical to the protection of your natural rights. So again, this point that he's making is that it's kind of like from a public perception, if the Supreme Court says that a law is constitutional, if the executive branch or the executive branch shouldn't be passing laws anyways, but if the legislative branch passes a law, or if the executive branch takes an executive action and the courts decide that it is constitutional, then it's interpreted by people in American society as being constitutional, no matter how fundamental, no matter how problematic it is as a challenge to our own natural rights, no matter how much damage it does to our right to life, liberty, and property. If the Supreme Court says that it's a constitutional right of the federal government, then it becomes, in the eyes of many people in society, an actual constitutional right. And so Rothbard is going to say that the best example of this phenomenon is the way in which the courts legitimized the massive expansion of governmental power that took place during the New Deal. And again, I think that this is incredibly true. The Supreme Court during the 1930s almost always said yes to every expansion of power that FDR wanted to give the federal government during the New Deal, even though most historians and economists that are kind of free marketers or from the Austrian libertarian perspective would say, and I think rightly so, that all of those were a complete abridgment or completely fundamentally in opposition to our natural rights as citizens, that none of them were constitutionally justified, and all of them were massive overreaches of our natural rights as citizens. But we've just come to accept it because the Supreme Court said back in the 1930s that the New Deal and the massive expansion of government that happened during that time period was constitutionally legitimate. Rothbard says that, of course, this is a giant double standard and that it doesn't actually do anything to protect our natural rights. Murray Rothbard then addresses attempts to overcome this problem, and he kind of gives us a quick history lesson on John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, very famously, was a congressman from South Carolina who served as vice president under John Quincy Adams, and he was the first to realize the flaw in this judicial system. And so he was the first to realize that an independent judiciary, quote unquote, wouldn't actually limit the power of the federal government. And he comes up with this idea called the concurrent minority. And the concurrent minority means, John C. Calhoun would argue that the concurrent minority essentially argues that states could veto unconstitutional laws, even if those unconstitutional laws are upheld by the courts. So Rothbard goes on to argue that this doesn't even go far enough, and that states should have the right both to nullify laws that they deem unconstitutional, and that states should also have the right to secede if the federal government violates their rights. This devolves power back to a more local and more personal level. And so his argument, I guess John C. Calhoun's argument that Murray Rothbard is going to pick up on here is that if the federal government overreaches and a state government thinks that they are denying or harming the natural rights of the state citizens, then the state government has the right to say no to whatever the federal government wants to impose on them. And if the federal government's not willing to go along with the state's veto, then states should have the right to leave the union. Because again, if the only purpose of the government is to protect our natural rights, then states should have the right to leave if the federal government is violating the natural rights of their citizens. And again, this entire idea is predicated on the notion of decentralization, that the only way that the government can protect our natural rights is if more and more decisions are made at more and more local levels. So again, he makes some really, really interesting arguments that I wish that more people would take into consideration today. And this is why, again, it's always going to be cynically misrepresented in the media. When somebody who is liberty-oriented says that we should not expand group-specific rights. But the argument that Murray Rothbard here makes that I think is incredibly important is the idea that group-specific rights will always violate the rights of other people, and having a Supreme Court or a judicial system does not guarantee that the state is going to be limited. And again, the judicial system is a part of the government. It's not truly a separate entity. And so even though I think that the framers of the Constitution I don't think that they ever conceptualized a state that had the technological inability or the technological abilities that 20th and 21st century technology has given to the state. So the idea that there would kind of be this massive surveillance state that could collect taxes and that could see into the private lives of all of its citizens was just completely unthinkable in the 18th century. And so while I feel like they had the best of intentions, and while I feel like our Constitution of the United States is certainly the best Constitution that exists so far, we can see how it's been very easily to manipulate what is written in the Constitution and in fact increase the size and scope of government based on a misreading or a misapplication of a constitution that was supposed to limit it. The next two sections in Rothbard's essay, Section 5 is entitled What the State Fears, and then Section 6 is entitled How States Relate to One Another. These two sections kind of go together, and so I'm going to take both of them in turn here, and we're going to see how they relate to one another. So the two things that all states fear, according to Murray Rothbard, are war and revolution, and that these are the two factors that lead to the death of every state. And so when a state goes to war, and he's going to make the argument in just a minute that you can really only have wars in the technical sense of the term when you have a state or when you have governments, that wars are kind of always the result of states wanting to expand their power or their political influence. But obviously war and revolution are dangerous to the life of the state. And so in order for the state to be successful in war and avoid revolution, the state always has to resort to propaganda. And the state is going to rely, again, on intellectuals in the media, intellectuals in higher ed, intellectuals in the government to create this propaganda to make us think that we need the state whenever there is a crisis that arises. Because, again, the state always is going to inherently want to expand its prestige and power. So it's in the nature of government to grow. I think that's a direct quote from Thomas Jefferson. It's in the nature of government to grow, and oftentimes wars are a reflection of the desire for, even if the government doesn't necessarily want to expand its geographical reach, governments oftentimes very much want to expand their influence, and I think that that's definitely been the reason why the United States has been involved in Middle Eastern politics since the end of World War II. I feel like there's this, I think that there is, and there's a lot of good history to back this up, mentality by our government leaders that if America is not involved in every aspect of world politics, that America will lose its power. And so, it has to create this propaganda regime that all of our wars and interventions overseas are designed to actually keep us safe and protect our natural rights, when in reality, all of the wars that the United States have fought, and you can apply this to any other society, are funded by the taxpayers. So the state must take money from productive people in order to pay for these wars. And they almost always deny the natural rights of people that are living overseas. And, with the advent of 9/11, or with the event of 9/11, 21 years ago, or however long ago that happened, we saw a massive increase domestically in the size and scope of the federal government. So not only did the war on terror obviously take away the rights of the 2 million innocent people that have been killed overseas because of that, and the millions of people that have been displaced and lost their homes or been wounded. It obviously denied them their natural rights. The surveillance state that has been imposed upon us in the United States in the wake of 9/11 has also denied us in a much less powerful way. But still, it's denied us of our natural rights as well. And the only way that the state can continue to keep these sorts of systems in place is if it propagandizes its citizens by telling them that they do it in order to protect them. them in order to serve their own needs. War is always going to expand the power of the state right until the state collapses because it can no longer support the wars that it is fighting. And again, this is the reason why, if you look back historically, kingdoms and empires rise and fall. They always expand to a much larger capacity than they can possibly sustain. And then people take advantage of that, and there's either a revolution or some other more powerful state that's not spread so thin that will then come in and destroy or take over the state. So governments are always going to resort to abuse of power, and they're going to resort to propaganda. And again, they don't want revolutions. And so whenever governments go to war, or whenever governments think that there's a potential for revolution, they're going to find ways to make it look as if the government actually has everything in control when they clearly do not, because a revolution is really bad for the health of the state. Murray Rothbard is then going to go on from that section in section 5 into section 6, which is how states relate to each other. So again, given the idea that the state's kind of primary function is to preserve itself, and so the state is going to use whatever propaganda or do whatever it can to preserve itself, states are always also going to be trying to increase their power. Again, if you give people that are in government the opportunity to have a lot of power and a lot of control, they're always going to do this. And in times past, the easiest way to do this is either through territorial expansion, which is kind of the way that the empires of the ancient world, the empires of the Middle Ages, and then kind of the early modern era, this is the way that these empires operated. They wanted to control as much geography and as much territory as possible. In the modern world, where these boundaries of these modern nation states are kind of set in stone, the way that countries like the United States expand is through political influence. And because of this, states are always going to be tempted to engage in war. Like if you are a smaller state and there's a larger state that wants to interfere in your state's politics because that larger state feels like it's in their interest, that's going to create a lot of dissension and anger within that smaller state, which will lead to conflict in war. And so Murray Rothbard has a little bit of history lesson here, and he's going to say that in the pre-modern world, wars were mostly seen as affairs of the nobles. So you would have one group of ruling class fighting against another ruling class, and they would maybe conscript people, or they might get volunteers, mercenaries that they would pay. But Murray Rothbard is going to argue that understanding of war in our society today is no longer possible, because war isn't just relegated to a small group of nobles with their interest, with their specific interest. And so Murray Rothbard is going to say that particular model of warfare is no longer possible, especially in the modern world, when we have these massive nation states that fight against one another for control and for power. There's no way that wars can be kind of these sideshows, these things that happen during a certain fighting season, but that have very little real relevance to people's lives. Instead, what we're going to see in a society that is defined by states, and especially in an increasingly globalized society, is that war is going to become more and more dangerous, more and more total, and more catastrophic. And again, if anyone thinks that this is not the case, the 20th century might have been the greatest century in terms of scientific and technological advancements, but it was also the bloodiest century in human history. More people died from war and political programs from statehood than in any other century in human history. Whether you died in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, all of the wars that took place in sub-Saharan Africa or across Asia, or whether you were a victim of communism in China or in Russia or in Cambodia, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history, and all of this had to do with the increasing size and power of these states. And again, there's that relationship, as we've discussed on this show before, between technological improvements and the ability for states to use technology to inflict harm on real people. He also is going to say that there's this inherent danger with states relating to one another, because during times of peace, states are going to rely on treaties, right? So you have these states that are competing with one another, and the only way to prevent states from going to war over territorial disputes or over disputes about who gets to influence which other states are through hot wars where people are shooting at each other. But then during times of peace, states are going to rely on treaties. But these treaties are not like contracts, and these treaties are often easily breached or written in a way that allows one state to exercise dominion over another. And so a lot of modern treaties between different nation states are asymmetrical in that there are certain, whether you're a G5 or a G7 country, and you're making a treaty with a smaller country, it allows certain states to exercise soft power over other states, which will inevitably create conflict. And so it is due to the nature of all powerful states, or maybe that's not the best way to put it. I think the way that I would frame that is that when you have states that have a massive amount of power, and we're seeing states accumulate more and more power, and it doesn't matter whether it's foreign power or whether it starts with domestic power by taking away and deliberately restricting the rights of its citizens. But whenever states have a massive amount of power, this will always lead to conflicts with other states that also want to have a massive amount of power, which will always lead to the possibility of total war. And in an era where nuclear war is a real possibility, and of course, with this conflict in Ukraine, we've never been closer to a nuclear war in my lifetime than we are right now. The problem is the powerful state. We would not, the situation that we're currently in right now would not be possible if Russia and the United States were not incredibly powerful, incredibly authoritarian states. And Murray Rothbard makes this point in this essay. So Murray Rothbard has a really the final section 7 of Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State. I'm going to read the entire thing because I think it's really interesting how he rounds out this article. This section is entitled History as a Race Between State Power and Social Power. And he's going to talk about the difference between allowing individuals to be free and make their own decisions and giving all of the power over to the state, which has kind of been the crux of everything that he's been talking about in this essay. And he says this to kind of bring us to a close today. He says, just as the two basic and mutually exclusive interrelations between men are peaceful cooperation or coercive exploitation, production or predation, so the history of mankind, particularly its economic history, may be considered as a contest between these two principles, between people cooperating with each other peacefully and between the coercive exploitation of the state. On the one hand, there is creative productivity, peaceful exchange, and cooperation. On the other, coercive dictation and predation over those social relations. Albert J. Nock happily termed these contesting forces social power and state power. Social power is man's power over nature, his cooperative transformation of nature's resources and insights into nature's laws for the benefit of all participating individuals. Social power is the power over nature, the living standards achieved by men in mutual exchange. State power, as we have seen, is the coercive and parasitic seizure of this production, a draining of the fruits of society for the benefit of non-productive and actually anti-productive rulers. While social power is over nature, state power is power over man. Through history, man's productive and creative forces have time and again carved out new ways of transforming nature for man's benefit. These have been the times when social power has spurted ahead of state power and when the degree of state encroachment over society has considerably lessened. But always after a greater or smaller time lag, the state has moved into these new areas to cripple and confiscate social power once more. If the 17th through 19th centuries were in many countries of the West times of accelerating social power and a corollary increase in freedom, peace, and material welfare, the 20th century has been primarily an age in which state power has been catching up, with a consequent reversion to slavery, war, and destruction. In this century, the human race faces, once again, the virulent reign of the state now armed with the fruits of man's creative powers, confiscated and perverted to its own aims. The last few centuries were times when men tried to place constitutional and other limits on the state, only to find that such limits, as with all other attempts, have failed. Of all the numerous forms that governments have taken over the centuries, of all the concepts and institutions that have been tried, none has succeeded in keeping the state in check. The problem of the state is evidently as far from solution as ever. Perhaps new passive inquiry must be explored if the successful final solution of the state question is ever to be attained. Very, very powerful way to end this very important essay. So I know today was even a little bit more of a shorter romp through the Anatomy of the State than last week. Again, the real foundation for this episode was part 1. I would highly recommend you go back and Listen to that. So again, just to conclude here, the state is inherently anti-capitalistic, so it's against the private ownership of the means of production, and it's against decentralized economic decision-making. Whenever you have a state, there will be people that will try to manipulate and use the power of the state to meet their own ends, which will always lead to the growth and the acceleration of the state. So the state is inherently anti-capitalistic, and again, it will almost inevitably accumulate more and more power. And again, as Rothbard eloquently says, and this is one of the goals of this show, the greatest threat to the state is independent intellectual criticism. One of the greatest quotations from The Anatomy of the State. The more that people are willing to step out and criticize the abuses of power that are made by the state, the harder it is for the state to continue to abuse power. So I really do think that the church needs to play a big role in this. And I think that criticism of state power is deeply intrinsic to the fabric of the scriptures. I think that not the majority, but there are a ton of passages within the Bible, not just passages, but entire books, entire themes, an entire kind of biblical worldview that deals with the problem of human power. And I do think that the church needs to play a role in criticizing state power, which again, when we as Christians criticize state power, what we're really doing is criticizing human beings that use that power for themselves, that use their power for their own ends. And so over the next couple of weeks, we're going to examine two very important biblical passages, 1 Samuel 8 and Romans 13, and we're going to look at how Rothbard's definition of the state as having a monopoly on violence and generating revenue through coercion kind of works in those two passages, that there's a sense in which the writers of the Bible have a very similar critique to state power that Murray Rothbard outlines in his book. And we're also going to explore how Christians ought to respond to and criticize the state when it oversteps its boundaries. I really do believe that the church has a major role to play in this practice. We have to confront the world with the reality of the gospel, and that is a massive check on the mythology of the state, that if you believe that Jesus is king, if you believe that Jesus is the Messiah, then by definition, human beings that take state power upon themselves cannot be. And so we're going to take a look at how this libertarian skepticism that I have towards state power is, in my opinion, the most natural consequence of the Bible's political theology. So I'm really excited to have those conversations with you guys. Again, thanks for listening for this entire episode. As always, I could have spent a lot more time diving into these issues in more depth. So if you have comments or criticisms, or if you would like me to address something in the anatomy of the state that I did not address on this episode, please feel free to reach out to me. You can follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod, and you can send me an email at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. I love hearing from you guys, and thanks again for listening. I will see you all next Tuesday. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.